I just wanted to say a little bit about the genesis of this program. I think that the first seeds for it were probably planted 4 years ago when Salem Quarterly Meeting, and I worked with Salem Quarterly Meeting to organize a bus trip of the Underground Railroad in western Cumberland County. And in researching the origins of the first Quakers to come here, I couldn't help but begin to notice how many Quakers had been incarcerated. This idea grew into doing this program when Mary Woodruff invited me to be part of an equal justice committee that she was putting together in Cumberland County. And finally, I've always been interested in the Fund for Sufferings, which is a Quaker committee that I encountered through my work with Quaker grantmakers and the Willits Book Trust of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And by having a conversation with Clerk Lee Garner, I was able to find Justin Loughry, Justin Loughry, who is actually a lawyer on our side of the Delaware River. And I met Elena through the Equal Justice Committee, and the three of us decided to do this program. One of the startling things that I encountered when I first looked at Quakers and imprisonment was that actually I wasn't even thinking about imprisonment. I was looking at early queries, or the questions that Quakers use today, as soul-searching frameworks for guiding ourselves in our quest to live the kinds of lives we wish to live. And when I looked at what the first two queries were, one of them was, which friends imprisoned on account of their testimony died in prison since this yearly meeting? That is from 1682, which would have been right after it became legal for Quakers to actually gather together. In the first 40 years, it was illegal for more than 5 Quakers to ever gather. And the second query was, which friends in the ministry in their respective counties departed this life since the last yearly meeting? It's striking for those of us today because our queries are really oriented towards our internal search, the way we steward our meetings, our peace testimonies. But these queries were used as more than Quaker cones. They were actually used as data collection devices. Quakers were still trying to map out who they were, and really the kind of vulnerability that the sect was experiencing at the time. 1 in 3 Quakers in London was in jail. The conditions in prison were really horrendous during this period of time. George Fox was actually in situations where urine and excrement came up to his shoes. There were rooms with 30 or 40 people, and Quakers were constantly being thrown in jail for things that it's hard to imagine could have been considered illegal, but it included not tipping your hat or taking your hat off to a person of higher social status, which in England was considered to be very important. And for Quakers at the time, it wasn't even really a social justice issue so much as it was that Quakers believed everyone, if there's any judgment, it's an inward judgment. And all people in their inward lives are equal. So Quakers were thrown in jail for blasphemy, for not paying tithes to the Church of England, and for the smallest kinds of offenses, including being really obnoxious and interrupting Anglican ministers. So I think that even when it became legal for Quakers to meet and they weren't threatened by jail, there were still it was still a very uncomfortable situation for Quakers in England. And this is one reason why George Fox, who spent 6 years in prison, and that's less than many people did, but George Fox came to our part of the world and spent time with the Indians investigating whether this would be a good place for Quakers to settle. And one of the things that he felt was that there were alliances, both in terms of peace testimony, in terms of a commitment to trade and cooperation with the native Lenape people here. And he felt that this could be a really safe place. And it's kind of important to point that out because it was not safe in other parts of the New World at that point. In Boston, 4 Quakers were actually murdered, killed for their beliefs. In England, nobody was sentenced to death, but thousands of Quakers did die because of the horrible conditions in prison. And this was the impetus for Quakers when they actually got out of prison, and even Quakers who were trying to abide with friends that were incarcerated, was to start working for better conditions. And one of the things that Elizabeth Fry in England tried to work on was the whole notion of trying to give people meaningful work. Quakers didn't actually come up with solitary confinement. That was actually a Calvinist's idea. And that particular person, named Howard, had no intention for it to be used in the kind of punitive way that it eventually became used for. His idea was that silence could be a form of repentance, more in the keeping with what you would think Quakers would be coming up with. But Elizabeth Fry wanted people to have work, and when she went into the prison, she encountered women who had children, and there wasn't proper bedding. So she began to organize other women to bring sewing materials into the church so that women could make beds for their children. And she organized schooling, not the church, the prison, organized schooling in the prison for the children that were in there with their mothers. So these gradual reforms, which included separate rooms, that was what Quakers were pushing for, separate rooms for prisoners, who at that time were 30 in a room, began to come about very, very slowly. But when Quakers did come to Salem County with John Fenwick, and Quakers came to Burlington within a couple of years, one of the first things that they did was create a document, a legal document, the concessions and agreements of the proprietors, freeholders, and inhabitants of the province of West Jersey. And West Jersey at that time was led by Quakers, and the document that they created actually kind of was 100 years earlier than the Bill of Rights. It included a lot of the kinds of concepts that you found in the Bill of Rights. And one of them was that there was no provision for arson, no provision for witchcraft, all of which were considered to be crimes in other part of America at the time. No penalty for murder was recorded. And a century before the Bill of Rights, it stated, "No proprietor, freeholder, or inhabitant shall be deprived or condemned of life, liberty, estate, property, or any way hurt in his or her experience without a fair trial." So this was actually a very progressive document in its day. And it was one of the reasons why it also included a very important testimony stating that no one would be persecuted or banished for their religious beliefs. Now this was really important because that was not true in Puritan parts of America at the time. I mean, the Puritans were arriving on vessels, contemplating the end of days, and thinking about killing Quakers and Catholics. So having a place like this that was safe for Presbyterians, Baptists, Quakers, Native people, and having the rights of Native people written in this document was very unusual in its day and set a kind of tone of tolerance and affirmation in our region that we like to think is still alive and well today, and something that we can nurture and protect. In addition to what was happening in South Jersey, William Penn was able to outlaw the death penalty until 1718. when English criminal law eventually overrode that. But I think that's very important, and many Quakers uphold and work towards that today. I just remember vividly an experience in my youth when I was invited to be part of a Salem Quarterly Meeting overnight experience for young people in Salem that Mike Wida organized. And Bill Waddington was speaking to us. You may have to correct me with this story, but the story as I remember it was a story he told about being in the Merchant Marine and going through the Gulf of Mexico and having his bunkmate wake up late at night and say to him, "Bill, I murdered a man." And Bill just let him speak. He didn't feel it was his job to report this person to the authorities. It would have, in fact, been against Quaker testimony to do so. And it was kind of the first time that I understood what it means to bear witness to another person's soul, and I think the young people in the room came to understand it through his story.
Hi, thanks very much, all of you, for coming. I don't know how big this meeting is or how large the catchment is, but the fact that you are here at 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon after maybe many of you being here for a number of hours is really impressive. I'm not sure how many pearls of wisdom I really have about the system. I've been practicing criminal defense law in New Jersey since 1985 as a public defender and as a private lawyer. I've seen a lot of heroism and a lot of great moments in the criminal justice system, and I've seen a lot of horror. I've seen a lot of demonization. I've seen a lot of suffering. On the part of not just defendants, by the way, and their families, but of course of those who are victimized. I want to just talk for a couple minutes about what I think might be a kind of a Quaker orientation, if you will, towards a system that is necessarily flawed, as all of us are flawed. It's a humanly constructed system. And as I said, there are moments of grace and beauty, and also moments of horror and evil. But how to be in that system and what orientation to take. And I'm going to talk about a couple of Quaker projects or efforts that are contemporary, that are happening now, even as we sit here today together. Let me start by telling a story I've told once or twice. If there's anybody here who's heard it, I apologize. A number of years ago, I was asked to speak at a seminar. It was actually part of a year-long training program for a group called Leadership New Jersey, an excellent project from what I know of it. My wife happened to be participating that year. It was an attempt to get people from various walks of life who were oftentimes sort of young or in the middle years of their work lives, of their careers, both from public service organizations, from companies, from banks, various societal institutions, get them together to tackle the question of studying a variety of social problems and institutions across the state of New Jersey. And the week that I was asked to come in and speak for a few minutes was the week or the month that they were looking at the criminal justice system. And I think most of that week had consisted of meeting with people from the Attorney General's office and from a variety of universities, and then going actually into the Department of Corrections and visiting prisons, which I thought was a wonderful thing that they've done. But they've kind of gotten a very institutionalized, I would suggest, slant on things. And so I think either for perspective or maybe for comic relief, they asked the criminal defense lawyer to come in the last day when they were having sort of a luncheon and a breakup session to give maybe a slightly different perspective on what they've been thinking and seeing and hearing. And this was a pretty prosperous, well-educated group of folks, very impressive group. Anyway, so it was my turn to speak, and I made some comments about maybe compassion for those who are caught up in the system. And there was a fellow down the back who had a quick question, almost an intervention, an interruption. Said that they had been at Trenton, what they used to call Trenton State Prison, that week, the day before. And they met with a lot of fairly young inmates. And they were folks who were convicted of really the most serious crimes. Because you don't go to Trenton State, I'm looking over at Jennifer McRae, I'm sure she knows. You don't go to Trenton State with a 3-year sentence or a 5-year sentence, probably a 20-year sentence and up. So, and it's probably the most difficult prison environment, from what I hear from those I speak with and places that I've visited, the most difficult environment in the state. Anyway, this fellow was really upset at the fact that a lot of these young people he was meeting, these young men, it was all men, seemed to have no remorse whatsoever, not accepting responsibility for what they had done. He was very, very judgmental and very critical of them, and was kind of critical at me for expressing any kind of compassion or sympathy for them. And it changed my orientation during that little presentation, and I said, I'm hearing a kind of us versus them dynamic here in this question and answer we're getting into. That we are on one side of this divide and they are on the other. And I said, I'm looking across this room and I'm going to say that a principal difference between those people who are in prison and the people who are in this wonderful little room with this nice spread is that some people commit crimes and they're caught, and lots of people commit crimes and they're not. And I said, I bet you that most of the people in this room, and here's probably where I stubbed my toe, so most of the people in this room have probably committed crimes. I thought I was going to have a plate thrown at me. Or maybe a bunch of plates. What do you mean? Moment of silence, and I said, well, who knows what the FAFSA application is? It's this massive application you have to fill out to get federal financial aid for your son or your daughter, young person in your family. And you hear these stories all the time about people who aren't 100% honest about the assets and the resources that they have available to fund that education, and they get more financial aid than people who maybe are more honest on those forms. So how about the mortgage application, where it says right there on the application for mortgage financing to get your house, is any part of this down payment, this earnest money that you're going to place, is any part of that borrowed? And of course you check off no, because you're not going to get the loan if you check off yes. And yet people have loaned money to their children, their nephews, their nieces, and they've gone in there with borrowed money and they have misrepresented, maybe not to a great extent, but they've misrepresented what their picture is, and they get the loan, and that's a federal crime. And how about those who are in business and they have to give out some subcontracts or what have you, and they get a nice plush sort of dinner from the sales rep from the company that is vying for the business that this executive has to hand out. And that's called commercial bribery. And that's a crime under New Jersey law as well as federal law. And as I went down the list, the room got quieter and quieter. And one fellow finally stood and said, I can't believe that this thing you just said about commercial bribery, I can't believe that that's a crime. I said, well, there you go. Now, I'm not saying there's a moral equivalence between these scenarios that I've just mentioned and someone who sticks up a bank with a loaded revolver or does some kind of horrible mayhem, but I think it's worth thinking about. That in some fundamental respect, and I think this is what friends, what Quakers might bring to this discussion, in some fundamental way, we are all riven, we are all broken. And so, rather than pity, or feeling sorry, or this kind of sentimental mushiness about coddling, I don't know, folks who are wrecking our communities with drug sales and all that, we could talk simply about compassion. And we could talk about non-demonization and trying to remember that people are not necessarily the sum of their worst acts, and that there is a redemptive possibility. I hope. Sometimes I have more hope than faith in that, but that there is a redemptive possibility. I think that the two efforts I wanted to talk about a little bit, and I'd like to be able to say what I've just said to judges, to prosecutors, to everybody who's a player in the system. And in the same breath, by the way, I would say that When I teach law school occasionally, and I teach a bunch of firebrand young law students who want to all become criminal defense lawyers, and they all think the worst of prosecutors, I say, no, they're human beings too. And they have jobs to do. They have responsibilities, different ones than yours, and many of them, most of them, are doing the very best they can. Remember that. And I'm not just saying that because Ms. McCrae is here. Her first assistant is someone I have been so fond of for years, Harold Shapiro. Who was a public defender, a federal public defender. And you were. And that's right, you were too. So I'm not just pandering, maybe a little bit, but I'm really not pandering. But just to say that, and the guys and the women with the black robes on, who oftentimes people on my side of the aisle denounce so much, they're human beings too. And they operate under a lot of pressures. They're afraid if they let someone out and not detaining them, that's the person who will end up on the front page of the paper shooting someone. And then there's public relations hell to pay, so to speak. So everybody is operating under burdens, but I think we do need to bring a high degree of sort of compassion and attempt in this system. And it's not just a question of revising our personal perspectives or ethics, but I think about what Dorothy Day used to say, the founder of the Catholic Worker. Is that name familiar to some people in this room? She was a great Christian interpersonalist and an anarchist, and she absolutely had this ethic of trying to see the best in everyone and try to see the brokenness, but also that of God in everyone. But she would also say, we need a world in which it is easier to be good. And what she meant, I think, was that we have to have better policies and structures and programs, not just one person to another person, not just the anecdotal, but really the systematic effort at goodness. Two things. In my meeting, in the Haddonfield monthly meeting, a few years ago, after several of us spent a very long time supporting and representing and defending an extremely unpopular defendant who was unjustly accused of something, and we spent almost a year of our lives developing his defense and getting him, extricating him from a horrendous trial. We began Friends Transition Support Services, which was really an attempt to have a project that would help with prisoner reentry issues. People coming out of prison into the community, what could we do? What kinds of efforts could we make? What kind of resources could we assemble? What kind of advice and counseling and support could we give? In whatever small ways we could. And what that's morphed into, so to speak, is something called the Garden Project. Now, some of you may have heard of this. There was a small Quaker meeting house in Camden, in downtown Camden, of all places. There are 6 members of that meeting and a few attenders. It is a valiant, intrepid group, I would say. I always compliment them for trying to make their presence known in the city of Camden. They have a nice big lot around the place, and there's a garden, and it's now a community garden. And a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, some very forward-thinking people who are part of our Friends meeting, or Medford meeting as well, decided to try to start a garden project where we would hook up with prison inmates who are now at a halfway house in Camden called Garrett House. They're Department of Corrections inmates, and they have some opportunities to do community service. And we thought, well, why don't they come down to our meeting on a Saturday, if we can persuade the Department of Corrections to allow it. Come on down, spend 4 or 5 hours with us, have lunch, work a little bit in the garden, have an educational program or two, and just be human beings one with another. And so this has gone on, I'm not going to say every Saturday, but many Saturdays each month for almost 10 years now. And we've had waves of female inmates, if you will, residents of Garrett House who are still in Department of Corrections custody, come down and spend time with us. And we've had some wonderful sharing and companionship, fellowship, sistership. Lots of people have graduated from that halfway house program, and they've graduated from our garden project program. Some of them come back many times. We have holiday dinners and so forth. And what we simply do is we try to get to know folks. Nobody talks about what you're in for, what your charges were, and all that. It is simply an attempt to treat folks really on the same plane that we would want to be treated. And that's the kind of comment that we get from folks. I actually have a copy of the flyer that we send out occasionally for fundraising issues. This is a quote from one of the folks that participated in our program, one of the women. The Garden Project is a place I can come on Saturdays and forget about everything that week and be treated like a human being, not judged. That means so much to us. This is based on a belief that there is that of God in every person, and if we can find a way to connect with that and appeal with that, we can make grace, we can make the good happen, not just for them, but for ourselves, because this helps to heal the broken places in us as well. So that's one effort. It's ongoing. I'm not here to make a pitch for it, but I will tell you that if you want to go onto the website of Haddonfield Meeting, you can find it at www.haddonfieldfriendsmeeting, what an original title, haddonfieldfriendsmeeting.org. There'll be some stuff there about the Garden Project, and you'll probably hear more from us in the next 6 months or so, because we've been doing very well with fundraising, but we have to keep up our efforts, so we're going to be making the rounds. That's one thing. Another project that I'm involved in personally, which is not as activist as that Garden Project, but in some ways is just as important, I think, at least psychologically, is something called the Fund for Sufferings, which is a project or a group within Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. It's a small committee, but we have kind of an endowment and some funds that have been raised and piled up and contributed from various sources. And what the Fund of Sufferings is all about is to have monies available to help support Quakers, mostly Quakers, occasionally a non-Quaker, who is trying to live out a Quaker testimony and really suffering in their material lives, and usually also in their spiritual lives, for carrying out that commitment. Whether it's committing civil disobedience on a highly principled basis and then facing fines or bail issues in Philadelphia in federal court, or over here in New Jersey, not so much bail in the state courts now, but having fines to pay that they cannot pay because they've taken some action in a conscientious way in keeping with the Quaker peace testimony. Folks who sat down in front of the federal courthouse at various junctures over the last several years protesting one turn of government policy or another, and then had $500 and $600 fines to pay, and some of them not in very good health, some of them quite elderly, and really not having the money, and so we would step in and offer to pay those fines. We had a woman who was doing great work trying to close a shooting facility, the words fail me right now, but it was a facility that really promoted the use and ownership of firearms in an urban area, and trying to help close that. It was in a neighborhood that was kind of beginning to really look like something in Philadelphia. They went and they launched a tremendous campaign, and they actually ended up getting the place closed. This particular advocate had medical problems and had to almost abandon her work. Her car broke down, and she needed a few $1,000s to keep on doing the work. She couldn't pay for the car repairs, and so we stepped in. And we bought her a car, so she could continue to go on circuit and get to these meetings and organize the community. These are just a couple of examples of the kinds of things we do. A year will go by and there's no call for our services, no call for our help, but we are always there. There's about 5 or 6 of us on the committee now. We're always there to try to help step up, particularly folks who are wrestling with these issues of maybe having to go to jail. I don't know if it really fits in with this program, but I was asked to talk about the Fund for Sufferings, and so I'll tell you that this is the kind of commitment that, from what I can see at least, the Society of Friends takes with the greatest of seriousness. And I hope that these 2 examples, and they're in some ways they're sensational examples, but they're also quite humble. They require ongoing effort, attention, commitment. The folks who run the Garden Project in Camden, they show up each session. They do lots of work to make things right, to make things go right. It's the kind of presence in the community and presence to folks who are hurting and who are suffering that I think is really so close to the heart of who we are. So I think this is mostly a plea that we try to find more of those opportunities, and that we do what we can to try to humanize and end, let's say, the demonization that we find so often in places like the criminal justice system.